Jake and Zara were still talking about the stories of human resilience when the emergency alarms began blaring throughout the station again. The red warning lights flashed brighter than before, and the automated voice that announced station alerts sounded more urgent than Jake had ever heard it. All personnel report to emergency stations immediately. The voice repeated in multiple languages. This is not a drill. All personnel report to emergency stations immediately. Jake quickly grabbed his uniform from the floor and started getting dressed while Zara stood frozen in his quarters, still holding the data pad with his urgent messages. The alarms were different this time, Jake realized. These were not the diplomatic emergency signals from earlier, but the deep, penetrating tones that meant the station itself was in danger. What's happening? Zara asked. Her voice filled with fear. Jake pulled on his shirt and checked his personal communicator. The device was flashing with priority messages from the human diplomatic section and from station command. As he read the first message, Jake felt his blood run cold. The Krell Empire, he said grimly. They've surrounded the station with a battle fleet. Zara's large silver eyes went even wider with terror. The Krell were one of the most aggressive species in the galaxy, a militaristic empire that had been expanding their territory through conquest. For decades, they rarely engaged in diplomacy, preferring to take what they wanted through force. Jake's communicator buzzed with an incoming call from Commander Brooks. He answered immediately while continuing to get dressed. Harrison, get to the command center now, Brooks said without preamble. The Krell have blockaded the station, and they're demanding the surrender of all human personnel. Why do they want the humans? Jake asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. They claim we're too dangerous to be allowed free movement through the galaxy, Brooks replied. They want to take us into custody for what they call galactic security purposes, Jake finished, putting on his uniform and grabbed his duty equipment. The situation was worse than the diplomatic crisis from earlier. The Krell didn't negotiate or compromise. If they wanted something, they usually just took it by force. I'll be there in 5 minutes, Jake told Brooks before ending the call. He turned to Zara, who was still standing in his quarters looking terrified. You need to get to the Valerian residential section, he told her. Stay with your people until this is over. What about you? She asked. I have to report to the Human Command Center, Jake said. We need to figure out how to handle this situation. As they left Jake's quarters, together, the corridors were filled with aliens moving quickly toward their designated emergency stations. The normal, orderly calm of the station had been replaced by barely controlled panic as beings from dozens of species tried to understand what was happening. Jake could see groups of Arcturians gathering in their flowing robes. Their usually graceful movements now hurried and nervous. Centauran families were moving together toward their section of the station, their children staying close to their parents. Even the normally confident dwarven engineers looked worried as they headed for their emergency positions. Lieutenant Harrison, came a voice from behind them. Jake turned to see Dr. Vex, one of the Andromedan diplomats he had worked with during the cultural exchange programs. The tall, thin alien was gliding toward them on his hover platform, his translucent body shimmering with what Jake had learned was a sign of agitation. Dr. Vex, Jake said, stopping to speak with the diplomat. What's the situation from your perspective? The Krell fleet consists of over 200 ships, Dr. Vex replied, his melodic voice carrying an undertone of fear. They have completely surrounded Nexus Prime and are demanding immediate compliance with their demands. Have they said anything about their intentions toward the other species on the station? Jake asked. They claim to have no quarrel with anyone except humans, Dr. Vex said. But the Krell have a history of expanding their demands once their initial objectives are met. No one believes that human personnel will be their only target. Jake understood the implications. The Krell were using humans as an excuse to take control of the station, but once they had established their authority, they would probably demand concessions from every species present. Nexus Prime was too strategically important for them to simply take the humans and leave. What are the other species planning to do? Jake asked DR. Vex's body flickered with deeper shades of concern. There is disagreement, he admitted. Some believe that surrendering the humans will satisfy the Krell and protect the rest of us. Others argue that giving in to Krell demands will only encourage further aggression. Jake felt a chill as he realized that some of the alien species might actually consider handing over to humans to save themselves. The careful diplomatic relationships that had taken years to build could collapse in a matter of hours. If the aliens decided that human lives were an acceptable price for their own safety, I need to get to the command center, Jake told Dr. Vex. Thank you for the information. As Jake and Zara continued toward their respective destinations, they could hear the sounds of the station's defensive systems activating. Nexus Prime was not a military installation, but it did have shields and some light weapons for protection against pirates and raiders. Against a Krell battle fleet, however, the station's defenses would be useless, Jake, Zara said quietly as they reached the junction where their paths would separate. The stories my people tell about humans, they also say that you never surrender. Even when the situation is hopeless, Jake looked at her, understanding the question she was really asking. The stories are right about that, he said. Humans don't give up easily, even if it means everyone on the station might die. She asked. Jake was quiet for a moment, thinking about the implications of what she was asking. The human diplomatic corps have protocols for situations like this, but those protocols assume that reasonable negotiations were possible. The Krell were not reasonable, and they had no interest in negotiating. I don't know what's going to happen, Jake said honestly. But I know that we won't just hand ourselves over to the Krell without a fight. Zara nodded slowly, her expression serious. Then the other stories about humans might be true as well, she said. The ones about what happens when you are forced to fight. Jake didn't ask what those stories said, but he could imagine. If humans had a reputation for being dangerous when cornered, the Krell were about to find out whether that reputation was deserved. They parted ways at the junction, with Zara heading toward the Valerian residential section and Jake continuing toward the human command center. As Jake walked through the corridors, he could feel the tension in the air. Every alien he passed looked frightened and uncertain, unsure whether they would survive the next few hours. The human command center was located in the diplomatic section of the station, and Jake could see that security barriers had already been activated around the area. Human personnel were moving with purpose and determination, but Jake could also see the stress in their faces. Commander Brooks was standing at the central command console when Jake arrived, coordinating with the other human diplomats and staff on the station. The room was filled with the sounds of communications equipment and the quiet voices of people trying to make sense of an impossible situation. Report, Brooks said when he saw Jake. The other species are divided about what to do, Jake said. Some want to hand us over to the Krell. Others think that would just encourage more aggression. The Krell fleet has over 200 ships and has completely surrounded the station. Brooks nodded grimly. That matches what we're hearing from other sources. The station commander is trying to negotiate with the Krell, but they're not interested in talking. They want all human personnel transferred to their ships within 6 hours, or they'll take the station by force. What are our options? Jake asked. Limited, Brooks admitted. The station's defenses can't stand up to a Krell battle fleet. We could try to evacuate in the emergency pods, but the Krell would just capture us in space. We could barricade ourselves in the human section and hope that help arrives. But the nearest human fleet is 3 days away. Jake looked around the command center at the faces of his colleagues. There were 50 humans on Nexus Prime, including diplomats, technical staff, and support personnel. Most of them had never been in a combat situation, and none of them were prepared for a fight against the Krell military. There's something else you should know, Brooks continued. We've been monitoring Krell communications, and this isn't just about us. They're planning to use control of this station as a base for expanding into the neutral zone. Taking the humans is just their excuse for establishing a military presence. Here, Jake realized that the situation was even worse than he had thought. The Krell weren't just targeting humans out of fear or hatred. They were using anti-human sentiment as a justification for a strategic, military operation that would threaten the entire galactic balance of power. So what do we do? Jake asked. Brooks looked at him with an expression that combined determination and resignation. We do what humans always do when someone tries to force us to surrender, he said. We find a way to fight back. Jake stood in his quarters, holding the sheet around his waist, trying to understand what was happening. Zara was still staring at his scars with an expression of wonder and fear that made no sense to him. The datapad in her hands contained urgent messages about the galactic crisis, but neither of them seemed to remember why she had come to his room. Zara, Jake said carefully, I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding. These are just old injuries from my time in the military. Nothing special about them. Zara shook her head slowly, her large silver eyes never leaving his scarred chest. You do not understand, she said in a voice filled with awe. My people have stories about humans that go back 50 years. From when your species first made contact with the galaxy. We thought they were legends. Jake felt confused and slightly uncomfortable standing there nearly naked while Zara examined him like he was some kind of museum exhibit. What kind of stories? Stories about the immortal warriors, Zara said, taking another step closer. Beings who could survive in the vacuum of space, who could heal from wounds that would kill any other species, who could fight for days without rest. My grandmother told me these stories when I was young, but I thought they were just tales to frighten children. Jake looked down at his own body again, trying to see what Zara was seeing. The scars were evidence of his military service, but they were also proof that he had survived injuries that might have been fatal. There was the long white line across his ribs from shrapnel during the colony wars, the circular mark on his shoulder from an energy weapon, and several smaller scars from various conflicts. These wounds, Jake said, touching one of the scars on his chest, they weren't that serious. Human medicine is pretty good at treating injuries. No, Zara said firmly. You do not understand what you are showing me. That scar on your chest, it goes directly over your heart. No Valerian could survive such an injury. No Arcturian, no Centaurian, no member of any species I know could live through that kind of damage. Jake realized that Zara was right about the location of the scar. He had been shot in the chest during a skirmish on one of the outer colonies, and the doctors had told him he was lucky to survive. The bullet had missed his heart by centimeters, but it had still required major surgery and weeks of recovery. The one on your arm, Zara continued, pointing to another scar. That looks like a burn from a plasma weapon. Such weapons are designed to kill instantly. There is no surviving a direct hit from plasma fire. Jake remembered that injury too. He had been caught in an explosion during a rescue mission, and the plasma had burned through his uniform and into his skin. The pain had been incredible, but the medical team had been able to treat the wound and save his arm. And this one, Zara said, indicating a scar on Jake's shoulder. This is from a projectile weapon. The angle suggests it went completely through your body. How is that possible? Jake was beginning to understand why Zara was so amazed. From her perspective, he was looking at someone who should have died multiple times, but was still walking around. The scars that he considered normal battle wounds were evidence of superhuman durability to someone from a species that was more fragile than humans. I spent 6 years in the Earth Defense Forces, Jake explained. We were involved in several conflicts during the early colonization period. Getting wounded was part of the job. Most soldiers have scars like these. Most human soldiers, Zara corrected him. No other species sends their people into combat expecting them to survive such injuries. The stories my people tell about human warriors are not exaggerations. They are warnings. Jake was starting to feel uncomfortable with the way Zara was talking. About humans. Warnings about what? About what happens when someone tries to fight a human, Zara said quietly. The stories say that humans do not know how to surrender. They fight until they win or until they die, and they are very difficult to kill. Jake had never thought about human military tactics from an alien perspective. What seemed like normal training and determination to him might look like terrifying fanaticism to species that were less physically resilient. You remember reading reports about first contact situations where alien forces had been shocked by human refusal to retreat, even when facing superior numbers. "We're not monsters," Jake said, feeling the need to defend his species. "We fight to protect our homes and our people, just like anyone else." "I did not say you were monsters," Zara replied. "But you are different from every other species in the galaxy. The scars on your body prove that you can survive things that would kill the rest of us. That makes you powerful, and power is always frightening." Jake sat down on the edge of his bed, still holding the sheet around his waist. The conversation had taken a turn he had not expected, and he was beginning to understand why relations between humans and other species were sometimes difficult. If other aliens saw humans the way Zara did, it explained a lot about the careful distance that most species maintain. "Is that why you've always been so formal with me?" Jake asked. "Because you're afraid of what I might do?" Zara was quiet for a long moment, considering her answer. "Not afraid exactly," she said finally, "but cautious. My people are taught to be respectful to humans because we understand that you are much stronger than you appear. We do not want to give offense to beings who could hurt us so easily." Jake felt a mixture of sadness and frustration. He had spent months trying to build a friendly relationship with Zara, not knowing that she saw him as a potential threat. The cultural barriers between them were even deeper than he had realized. "I would never hurt you," Jake said earnestly. "I've been trying to be your friend, but you always keep your distance." "I thought it was just Valerian culture." "It is partly our culture," Zara admitted, "but it is also what we know about humans. The stories say that your people are kind and generous when they are happy, but terrible when they are angry. We try to avoid making humans angry." Jake understood now why his attempts at casual conversation had been met with polite but distant responses. Zara had been treating him like a dangerous animal that needed to be handled carefully. The thought made him feel lonely and misunderstood. "What exactly do these stories say about humans?" Jake asked, genuinely curious about how his species was perceived by other. Zara set down the datapad and moved closer to Jake, her fear apparently replaced by fascination. "They say that humans came from a world so dangerous that only the strongest could survive. They say that human children are taught to fight before they can walk properly. They say that humans have conquered every environment on their home world, from the deepest oceans to the highest mountains." Some of that was true, Jake realized. Earth was more dangerous than most worlds that supported intelligent life. Human children did learn to compete and struggle from an early age, and humans had indeed adapted to live in every environment on their planet. They say that humans can survive without food for days, without water for longer than most species can survive, without air. They say that humans can function normally in temperatures that would kill other beings, and that they can heal from injuries that would cripple anyone else. Jake thought about human endurance capabilities compared to other species. Humans could indeed survive in extreme conditions that would be lethal to most aliens. What seemed like normal human adaptability was apparently considered superhuman by galactic standards. The stories also say that humans form emotional bonds that last for their entire lives, and that they will die to protect the beings they care about. They say that humans never abandon their friends, even when continuing the fight means certain death. Jake felt a strange pride in hearing these descriptions of human loyalty and determination. Even if the stories were exaggerated, they contained truths about human nature that he recognized. Are the stories true? Zara asked quietly. Are humans really as strong and dangerous as we have been told? Jake looked at his scars again, seeing them through Zara's eyes. Each mark was proof that he had survived something that should have killed him. His body was evidence of human resilience and determination that other species found both admirable and terrifying. I guess they're more true than I realize, Jake said honestly. "I never thought about it from your perspective before. What seems normal to me must look pretty extreme to someone who hasn't seen humans in action." Zara nodded slowly. Her understanding of Jake and his species clearly changed by what she had seen. The formal distance between them was beginning to dissolve as she realized that the human she had been serving was not just another alien diplomat, but a representative of the legendary warriors her people whispered about the urgent communications that had brought her to his room were forgotten as they continued to talk, both of them seeing each other in a completely new light for the first time. The crisis began at 1400 hours when the emergency alarms started blaring throughout Nexus Prime. Jake was in the middle of a routine meeting with the Andromedan Cultural Committee when the lights began flashing red and the station's automated voice announced a priority diplomatic emergency. Jake excused himself from the meeting and rushed to the human diplomatic section where Commander Brooks was already coordinating with the other species representatives. The situation was serious enough that all scheduled activities had been suspended, and the Parisian station was moving to emergency protocols. "What's happening?" Jake asked as he entered the command center border dispute in the Vega sector. Brooks replied, without looking up from his communications console. "The hegemony and the coalition are both claiming the same asteroid mining rights. 3 ships have already been destroyed, and both sides are mobilizing their fleets." Jake felt his stomach drop. The Vega sector was strategically important because it controlled access to several major trade routes. If the 2 largest galactic powers went to war over it, the conflict could spread throughout the neutral zones and drag dozens of other species into the fighting. "How bad is it?" Jake asked, though he already suspected the answer. "Bad enough that every species on this station is being asked to choose sides," Brooks said grimly. "The hegemony wants our support based on the trade agreements we've been negotiating. The coalition is offering us exclusive mining rights in 3 systems if we back their claim." Jake understood the problem immediately. Humans were still newcomers to galactic politics, and their decision could determine which side other species supported. Both the hegemony and coalition had been courting human favor for years, but now they were demanding a choice that could make enemies of billions of beings. The emergency session lasted for hours as representatives from every species on the station argued about the best response. The Arcturians wanted to maintain strict neutrality, while the Centaurians saw an opportunity to profit from the conflict. The Dwarven engineers were concerned about the safety of their mining operations, and the Andromedans were worried about the cultural damage that war might cause. Jake found himself in meeting after meeting, translating between species, clarifying human positions, and trying to find common ground where none existed. The stress was enormous because every decision felt like it might trigger a war that could destroy the fragile peace that had existed for decades by 2200 hours. Jake was exhausted. The emergency sessions had been suspended until morning, but no progress had been made. Both sides in the conflict were becoming more aggressive, and several species were already choosing sides. The station felt tense and dangerous, with groups of aliens gathering in corners and whispering about secret alliances. Jake returned to his quarters feeling drained and frustrated. The diplomatic corps had trained him for complex negotiations, but nothing had prepared him for the possibility of galactic war. The decisions being made in the next few days could determine the fate of billions of beings across hundreds of worlds. He sat at his desk and tried to work on his reports, but his mind kept wandering to the implications of the crisis. If humans chose the wrong side, they could find themselves isolated from the galactic community. If they chose correctly, they might gain influence and respect, but they would also make powerful enemies. The work was slow and difficult because Jake's thoughts kept returning to the meetings he had attended. He had seen fear in the eyes of several alien diplomats, and he had heard the anger in their voices when they discussed the possibility of war. These beings had lived through conflicts before, and they understood the terrible cost of galactic warfare. Jake's personal communicator buzzed with messages from other human diplomats on the station. They were all struggling with the same problems, trying to understand the complex political relationships between species, and figure out the best path forward for humanity. Time seemed to move slowly as Jake worked on his reports. The station was quieter than usual because most beings were in their quarters discussing the crisis with their home worlds. Jake could hear the hum of the life support systems and the distant sounds of maintenance, crews working to keep the station operational. During the emergency, the stress was wearing on everyone, Jake realized. Even the normally efficient Delarian staff seemed nervous and distracted. Zara had been more formal than usual during their brief interaction that morning, and Jake had noticed that she kept glancing at the emergency status lights in the corridors. Tried to focus on his work, but the report seemed unimportant compared to the crisis developing around the station. He was supposed to document the day's meetings and provide analysis of the various species' positions. But everything felt uncertain and temporary around midnight. Jake's eyes were burning from staring at his computer screen. He had been working for 10 hours straight, and his body was telling him that he needed rest. But every time he tried to stop working, his mind returned to the problems that would be waiting for him in the morning. Jake finally decided that he needed to sleep, even if it was only for a few hours. He saved his work and stood up from his desk, feeling the stiffness in his back and shoulders from sitting in the same position for so long. His quarters felt small and confining after the stress of the day. The shower felt good after the long day, and Jake let the hot water wash away some of the tension in his muscles. He was still thinking about the crisis as he dried off and prepared for bed. The problems would still be there in the morning, but maybe a few hours of rest would help him think more clearly. Jake was too tired to bother with pajamas, so he simply dropped his towel and collapsed onto his bed. The sheets felt cool against his skin, and he closed his eyes and tried to clear his mind of the day's worries. Sleep came slowly, but eventually Jake drifted off despite the stress and uncertainty. He was awakened by the sound of his door opening. Jake's eyes snapped open, and he sat up in bed, confused and disoriented. The room was dark, except for the light from the corridor, and he could see a figure standing in the doorway. Lieutenant Harrison. Came Zara's familiar voice, but it sounded strange and uncertain. I have urgent communications for you from the diplomatic corps. Jake was fully awake now, but he was also completely naked. He had forgotten to lock his door, and Zara had used her maintenance access to enter his quarters. She was standing in the doorway holding a data pad with what were probably the emergency messages he had been expecting. Zara, double quotes Jake started to say, but he stopped when he saw her reaction. She was staring at him with an expression Jake had never seen before. It wasn't embarrassment or shock at seeing him undress, though Jake had expected that reaction given what he knew about Valerian. Modesty. Instead, Zara looked amazed, almost frightened, as if she was seeing something impossible. Jake quickly grabbed his sheet and wrapped it around his waist, but Zara continued to stare at him. Her large silver eyes were wide with what looked like recognition, and she seemed to be examining every visible part of his body. I'm sorry, Jake said, feeling embarrassed about the situation. I forgot to lock the door. I was just ... Your scars, Zara whispered, interrupting him. Her voice was filled with something that sounded like awe. The stories are true. Jake looked down at his own body, confused by her reaction. His chest and arms were covered with scars from his military service before joining the diplomatic corps. He had been wounded several times during conflicts on Earth and in the early human colonies, but the scars had healed well, and he rarely thought about them. What stories? Jake asked. Still holding the sheet around his waist, Zara took a step into the room, her eyes still fixed on Jake's scarred torso. The stories about humans, she said quietly. The ones my people tell about the immortal warriors who cannot be killed. Jake stared at her, completely confused. I don't understand what you mean. The scars, Zara repeated, pointing at the white lines that crossed Jake's chest and arms. They prove that you have survived injuries that would kill any other being. My people have heard the stories, but we thought they were myths. Jake looked at his scars again, seeing them through Zara's eyes for the first time. The marks were evidence of bullets, shrapnel, and energy weapons that had wounded him during his military career. Any one of those injuries could have been fatal, but human medicine and natural healing had allowed him to recover. These are just old wounds, Jake said, still not understanding why Zara was reacting so strongly. Everyone in the military gets hurt sometimes. Not like this, Zara said, shaking her head. Not wounds that should have killed you? My people know about human resilience, but seeing the proof. She trailed off, still staring at Jake's scars. Jake was beginning to understand that this moment was about more than just an embarrassing accident. Zara was seeing something that challenged everything she thought she knew about humans, and her reaction suggested that the stories about human durability were more widespread than Jake had realized. The urgent communication she had brought were forgotten as they stared at each other in the dim light from the corridor. Jake could see that Zara's understanding of humans was changing in real time, and he realized that this accidental encounter might be the key to bridging the cultural gap that had existed between them. Jake had been living on Nexus Prime for over 2 years, but he still felt like an outsider most days. The morning started like any other, with his alarm going off at 600 hours station time. He rolled out of bed and headed to the small bathroom attached to his quarters, not bothering to put on clothes for the short walk across his private room. This was normal for humans, Jake thought as he splashed cold water on his face. Privacy was privacy, and what he did in his own quarters was his business. But he had learned that most other species had very different ideas about personal habits and body awareness. Jake remembered his first week on the station when he had answered his door wearing only a towel after a shower. The Valerian maintenance worker who had come to fix his air recycler had nearly fainted at the sight. Jake had been confused until his human supervisor explained that most alien species never showed their skin to others, even partially. The cultural differences went deeper than just clothing. Jake had noticed that most species kept their living spaces much warmer than humans preferred. The Arcturians liked their rooms so hot that Jake broke into a sweat just visiting their diplomatic offices. The Centaurians kept their quarters humid and dim, while the Andromedans preferred cool, dry environments with very bright lighting. Food was another constant challenge. The station's dining facilities tried to accommodate everyone, but what was delicious to one species might be poisonous to another. Jake had learned to stick to the human-approved foods after accidentally eating something that made him sick for 3 days. The Valerians ate mostly liquid nutrients, while the Dwarven engineers consumed dense, high-energy blocks that looked like metal. To Jake, language barriers created daily misunderstandings despite the translation devices everyone carried. Jake had learned that many concepts simply didn't translate well between species. Human emotions like embarrassment or humor often confused other beings, while their social structures and motivations were equally puzzling to humans. The most difficult part was the formal protocols that governed every interaction. Each species had elaborate rules about how to address members of other races, when to make eye contact, how to position oneself during conversations, and countless other details that could cause offense if done wrong. Jake had memorized dozens of these protocols, but he still made mistakes regularly. Just last week, he had accidentally insulted a Centaurian diplomat by sitting before being formally invited to do so. The meeting had been tense until Jake apologized in the proper ceremonial manner. Zara represented all these challenges in one person. She was professional and efficient, but Jake could tell she was uncomfortable around him. She spoke to him in the formal, careful way that Valerians use with outsiders, always maintaining physical distance and avoiding direct eye contact. Jake had tried to be friendly with her, asking about her home world and her family, but she always gave brief, polite answers that didn't reveal anything personal. He had learned that Valerians lived in large family groups and that their society was built around service to others. But Zara never talked about her own experiences or feelings. Other human diplomats on the station had similar problems with their assigned staff. During their weekly meetings, They often discussed the challenges of working with beings who didn't understand human social customs. Some humans had given up trying to connect with their alien colleagues and just focused on doing their jobs. Jake didn't want to give up, but he was running out of ideas. Every attempt at casual conversation with Zara ended with polite but distant responses. She performed her duties perfectly, cleaning his quarters, delivering messages, and managing his schedule, but their interactions felt cold and formal. The problem wasn't just with Zara, Jake realized. He had similar issues with most of the non-human staff on the station. The Arcturian administrators were polite, but seemed to view humans as barely civilized. The Centaurian financial officers were efficient, but treated human requests with barely concealed impatience. Even the Dwarven engineers, who were probably the most similar to humans in their directness, kept their conversations focused strictly on technical matters. Jake had started to notice how the different species interacted with each other compared to how they interacted with humans. The Valerians were much more relaxed around the Arcturians, engaging in what seemed like friendly conversation. The Centaurians and Andromedans had elaborate greeting rituals that involved complex gestures and formal phrases. Even the usually gruff Dwarven engineers had casual relationships with the maintenance crews from other species. It was as if humans were still being evaluated, Jake thought. The other species had been part of the galactic community for hundreds or thousands of years. They had established relationships, understood each other's customs, and had learned to work together despite their differences. Humans were the newcomers. Still proving themselves worthy of acceptance, this feeling was reinforced during Jake's diplomatic meetings. He often sensed that the other species were being patient with humanity rather than treating them as equals. They would explain things slowly, repeat important points, and sometimes exchange glances that suggested they were dealing with children who didn't understand the complexities of galactic politics. Jake had mentioned this to his supervisor during their last quarterly review. Commander Brooks had nodded knowingly and explained that this was normal for new species joining the galactic community. Humans had to prove themselves over time, demonstrating that they could be trusted with important responsibilities and that they understood the delicate balance of interspecies relations. The process was frustrating, but Jake understood the logic. Humans had a reputation for being impulsive and aggressive compared to most other species. Earth's history was full of wars and conflicts, and humanity had only achieved global peace relatively recently. Other species had good reasons to be cautious about fully trusting humans with sensitive diplomatic matters. Jake had seen evidence of this caution in many of his interactions. Important decisions were often made in meetings that humans weren't invited to attend. Critical information was sometimes shared with other species first, with humans receiving updates later. Even on Nexus Prime, the human residential section was located in a less central area of the station. Despite these challenges, Jake tried to remain optimistic about human-alien relations. He had seen progress during his time on the station, even if it was slow. The trade agreements with the Centaurians were moving forward, and the cultural exchange programs with the Andromedans were producing positive results. Some of the younger aliens seemed more open to working with humans than their older colleagues. Jake had also noticed that some species were more accepting of humans than others. The Dwarven engineers appreciated human technical skills and work ethic. A few Arcturian scholars had expressed interest in human art and literature. Even some Valerians seemed curious about human customs, though they were too polite to ask direct questions. The key seemed to be patience and persistence. Jake had learned that rushing relationships with alien species usually backfired. Trust had to be built slowly through consistent actions and demonstrated reliability. Cultural understanding came from careful observation and respectful questions, rather than assumptions. Jake's relationship with Zara was a perfect example of this challenge. She was clearly intelligent and capable, but their interactions remained formal and distant. Jake suspected that she might be more interesting and complex than she appeared, but he had no way to get past the cultural barriers that kept them apart. Sometimes Jake wondered what Zara really thought about humans. Did she see them as the dangerous, Newcomers that some species whispered about. Was she afraid of Jake, or just following cultural protocols about maintaining distance from outsiders? He had no way of knowing, because she never let her guard down around him. The language barrier made things even more complicated. Even with translation devices, subtle meanings and emotions often got lost. Jake had learned to listen for tone and watch for body language, but alien expressions and gestures were often impossible to interpret. Correctly, Jake finished his morning routine and prepared for another day of diplomatic meetings. He had sessions scheduled with 3 different species, each with their own protocols and expectations. The work was important, but it could be exhausting to constantly monitor his behavior and words to avoid giving offense. As he gathered his materials for the day, Jake heard the familiar sound of Zara's cleaning cart in the hallway. She would arrive soon to tidy his quarters and deliver any messages that had come in overnight. Their interaction would be brief and professional. Just like every other day, Jake wondered if things would ever change between them, or if the cultural differences were simply too great to overcome. He hoped that someday he would understand the aliens around him better, and that they would come to see humans as more than just the dangerous newcomers from a violent world. Jake Harrison woke up to the sound of his alarm beeping softly in his small quarters aboard Nexus Prime. The diplomatic station floated in the neutral zone between 3 major galactic powers, and Jake had called it home for the past 2 years. He stretched his arms above his head and felt the familiar ache in his shoulders from sleeping on the standard-issue bed that was too small for his. Human frame, the room was basic but functional, with gray metal walls and a small window that showed the endless stars outside. Jake had tried to make it feel more like home by putting up pictures of Earth and keeping a small plant on his desk, but it still felt cold and alien. Most things did when you were the only human in a section designed for beings half your size. Jake pulled on his uniform and checked his reflection in the small mirror mounted on the wall. His brown hair was getting longer than regulation allowed, and he made a mental note to visit the station's grooming facilities later. The uniform was standard diplomatic Corps blue with the Earth insignia on the shoulder, marking him as one of the few human representatives in this part of the galaxy. As he finished getting dressed, Jake heard a soft knock at his door. He pressed the button to open it and found Zara standing in the hallway with a cleaning cart and fresh linens. She was a Valerian, one of the species that seemed to run most of the domestic operations on stations like this one. Her pale blue skin caught the light from the corridor, and her large silver eyes looked down at the floor as she spoke. "Good morning, Lieutenant Harrison," she said in her soft, musical voice. "I am here to clean your quarters and provide fresh supplies." Her English was careful and precise, with the slight accent that most non-human species had when speaking human languages. Jake stepped aside to let her in. "Morning, Zara. How are you today?" He had learned her name months ago and always tried to be friendly, though she seemed uncomfortable with casual conversation. "I am well, thank you," she replied, already moving efficiently around the room. She worked quickly and quietly, changing the bed sheets and wiping down surfaces with practiced movements. Jake noticed how she avoided looking directly at him and kept her distance whenever possible. This was normal for Valerians, Jake had learned. They were a reserved species that valued personal space and formal interactions. Zara had been assigned as his domestic aide when he first arrived at the station, and their relationship had remained strictly professional despite the months they had been working together. Jake gathered his personal items from the desk while Zara worked. He had a meeting with the Centauri trade delegation in an hour, followed by a session with the Andromedan Cultural Exchange Committee. It was going to be another long day of careful diplomacy and translation between species that barely understood each other. "Will you be dining in your quarters tonight, Lieutenant?" Zara asked as she organized his small kitchenette. "Probably," Jake replied. "I have reports to write after the afternoon sessions." He paused, watching her work. "Zara, can I ask you something?" She froze for a moment, then nodded carefully. "Of course, Lieutenant. Do you enjoy working here on the station? I mean, away from your home world?" It was a personal question, and Jake could see her discomfort. Valerians rarely discussed their feelings or personal lives with outsiders. She was quiet for a long moment before answering, "The work is satisfactory," she said finally. "It provides purpose and compensation." She didn't elaborate, and Jake didn't push. This was the problem with interspecies relations, Jake thought. Everyone was so careful and formal that real connections were almost impossible. Humans had only been part of the galactic community for 50 years, and most species still saw them as newcomers who didn't understand the established protocols. Jake finished gathering his things and headed for the door. "I'll see you later, Zara. Thanks for keeping everything tidy." She nodded and continued working without looking up. Jake left his quarters and walked down the curved corridor toward the diplomatic section of the station. The hallways were wide and well lit, designed to accommodate the various sizes and needs of dozens of different species. He passed groups of aliens as he walked, each species keeping mostly to themselves. The tall, thin Arcturians moved in graceful groups, their flowing robes rustling softly. A cluster of short, stocky dwarven engineers discussed technical matters in their gruff, industrial language. Two Andromedan diplomats glided past on their hover platforms, their translucent bodies shimmering in the artificial light. Jake was used to being stared at. Humans were still something of a curiosity in this part of the galaxy. They were newer to space travel than most species, and their physical appearance was different enough to draw attention. Jake had learned to ignore the looks and whispers that followed him. The diplomatic wing of the station was busier than usual. Jake could see representatives from at least 12 different species moving between meeting rooms and conference halls. The neutral zone was heating up again, with tensions rising between the major powers. That meant more meetings, more negotiations, and more careful dancing around sensitive topics. Jake's first meeting was with the Centauri trade delegation in Conference Room 7. The Centaurians were reptilian humanoids with excellent mathematical minds and a talent for complex financial arrangements. They had been negotiating a trade agreement with Earth for 6 months, and progress was slow. As Jake entered the conference room, he saw 3 Centaurians already seated at the oval table. Their scaled skin was a deep green color, and their large eyes could move independently of each other. It was disconcerting until you got used to it. "Good morning, Lieutenant Harrison," said the lead negotiator, whose name was something unpronounceable that Jake had learned to approximate. "We have reviewed your latest proposals regarding the mineral rights agreements." Jake took his seat and activated his translation device. Even though most species on the station spoke some form of standard galactic, the nuances of diplomacy require precise translation. "I'm glad to hear that. What are your thoughts?" The meeting lasted 2 hours and covered everything from shipping routes to tax implications. The Centaurians were thorough to the point of obsession, examining every detail of the proposed agreements. Jake found himself admiring their patience, even as it frustrated him. After the Centaurians, Jake had lunch in the station's main dining facility. The food was designed to be acceptable to most species, which meant it was bland and nutritionally complete but not particularly enjoyable. Jake missed real Earth food, but the station's synthesizers did their best with the limited options. The afternoon brought meetings with the Andromedan Cultural Committee and a briefing on the latest developments in the Outer Territories. By the time Jake returned to his quarters, he was exhausted and ready for a quiet evening. Zara had been by again while he was gone. His quarters were spotless, and she had left fresh towels and a small meal in the food preparation area. Jake ate the simple meal while reviewing his notes from the day's meetings. The work was important, but it could be lonely. Jake was one of only 50 humans on a station that housed over 10,000 beings. Most of his colleagues were scattered across other sections, and social interaction between species was limited by cultural barriers and communication difficulties. Jake settled at his desk to work on his reports. The diplomatic corps required detailed documentation of every meeting and interaction, partly for record keeping and partly to help other human diplomats understand the various species they worked with. As he worked, Jake found himself thinking about Zara. She was efficient and professional, but he sensed there was more to her than she showed. Most Valerians he had met were similar polite, reserved, and careful not to reveal too much about themselves or their culture. The reports took longer than expected, and Jake found himself working late into the night. The station operated on a 24-hour cycle to accommodate the various species' sleep patterns, but it meant that some sections were always quiet, while others remained active. Jake finally finished his work around midnight and prepared for bed. Tomorrow would bring more meetings, more negotiations, and more careful navigation of the complex relationships between species that have been interacting for centuries, before humans ever left their home planet. As he settled into his narrow bed, Jake looked out the small window at the stars. Somewhere out there was Earth with its blue oceans and green continents. He missed it sometimes, but he also knew that his work here was important for humanity's future in the galaxy. Jake closed his eyes and tried to sleep, unaware that tomorrow would bring changes that would alter his understanding of his place in the galactic community forever.